Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Our program will begin shortly. Good afternoon. Welcome to Library in Your Living Room, our series of virtual programs. I'm Beth Keller, and on behalf of the Highland Park Public Library, thank you very much for joining us today. We're very excited to welcome back Jim Marquardt. Jim is a frequent lecturer for the library. He's joining us today to discuss the 2020 presidential election and America's international relations. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Friends of the Highland Park Public Library, so we thank them for their generosity. Jim is an associate professor of politics at Lake Forest College and chair of the International Relations Program. He specializes in American foreign policy and international relations. Before I turn it over to Jim, please note that as an attendee today, your camera and microphone are turned off. We will conclude the program with questions and answers, and those can be asked by typing in the chat box. The chat box is turned off now, but it will be enabled towards the end of the program, and you can type your questions in the chat. To access the chat box, you'll see a little icon at the bottom of your screen. I'll turn it over to Jim now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Beth. Thanks also to the people at the Highland Park Public Library for sponsoring today's talk. And it's always a pleasure to be able to speak to my fellow citizens on issues that are important to our politics. And today, my concern is the election and American foreign policy and international relations. So where do we begin? Well, we can state the obvious, which is the election is 4 weeks away from today. We know that in some parts of the country that completed absentee ballots and mail-in ballots are already being returned to county election officials. Here in Lake County, Illinois, as you may know, early voting has already begun at the county's main voting office in Waukegan. And in a short period of time, I believe that date is Monday, October the 19th, early voting begins at the Highland Park Country Club on Park Avenue West here in Highland Park. So much of our attention nowadays is focusing on the election, especially in relation to COVID-19 and how COVID-19 is being politicized as an election issue. And I thought I'd never hear myself say these words, but I'm concerned as to whether the election will be conducted fairly and that all properly cast ballots will be duly counted. I hope I'm wrong, of course, but I'm nonetheless concerned. I think many of us are concerned. It's fair to say that our national elections are supposed to be about serious debates on the future direction of our country, in which our candidates, especially for president, are going to share with us their views on major policy issues. Now, to the extent that there has been serious attention to policy issues in the 2020 election, domestic policy have clearly taken precedence over foreign policy. And this really should not come as a big surprise to us. Only in rare exception, such as the 2004 national election, have debates about foreign policy shared equal billing with domestic policy. And if you can recall, in 2004, the big issue was the insurgency in Iraq and what we should do about it. Today's talk is about the upcoming presidential election and the United States' international relations. More precisely, today's talk considers the two strategic visions of the major party candidates, the incumbent President Donald Trump and his challenger, former Vice President Joe Biden, and what their visions are for America's role in the world, and specifically what kind of foreign policies flow from that vision of America's role in the world. The main question that's kind of guiding my presentation today is as follows. Where do the candidates stand when it comes to America's role in the world? And more specifically, the US's relationship to the so-called liberal international order that has guided international relations over the past 70 plus years. So before I dive into that question, I want to make a couple of preliminary points and then lay out some general observations about public attitudes towards foreign policy. So two preliminary points. First, there is little doubt that factors internal to the United States have an impact on our foreign policy. So for instance, interest groups matter, right? They help shape American foreign policy. The individual attributes of policymakers, how they think, what their cognitive capabilities are, what their belief systems are. These things also matter in terms of how we make our foreign policy. And it's also fair to say, of course, that partisan affiliation matters. What you believe in terms of your politics makes a difference. And as I'm going to argue a little bit down the road, this partisan affiliation is becoming increasingly pronounced in foreign policy ideas among the American people, and that's being reflected in the major party candidates as well. So as elections are held, of course, and as presidents and political parties surrender power to others, foreign policy is bound to change. This is inevitable, it's part of the political process. Secondly, however, I want to make a counter argument, and that is to say, in spite of these internal factors, which tend to underscore the differences in our politics and how these differences generate different foreign policies, there are also important external factors at play. That is, things going on in the world that impact American foreign policy and that to a certain degree provide some level of conformity, consistency in our foreign policy, regardless of what political party is in power and regardless of who's going to be making foreign policy decisions. Most importantly, I want to argue that changes in global power relations between America and other countries is one such factor. And in my view, it is a particularly important one, perhaps the most important external factor. I think it's fair to say, without diminishing our country's incredible power, that as America's dominant power position in the world continues to decline relative to others over the years, the American people and American politicians have become, let's say, increasingly circumspect about the nature of America's global commitments. And with the legacy of the Iraq War still very much fresh in our minds, and with a war in Afghanistan that's still underway after 19 years, there is a growing aversion to the use of force, especially when, as in these instances, force has very high costs in terms of lives and dollars and has diminished America's standing in the world. More generally, however, I think as America's relative position, as its dominant position in the world continues to decline relative to others, America will have increasingly difficult choices to make. And those choices are going to be evident in our domestic politics and will shape the foreign policies of whomever is president, generally in a direction towards greater restraint in the nature of our global interactions. So let me just kind of now, having put those two preliminary points out, let me just kind of lay out the main argument that I want to make, and then begin to kind of walk through that argument in its various parts. So it's fair to say that the president and the former vice president have very different visions of America's role in the world. And the election of one of them is going to have an impact on our foreign relations, no doubt. President Trump calls for America to rebuild its economic power by putting, quote unquote, America first. A Trump reelection will likely see the US's further withdrawal from the liberal international order in steps that include the reassertion of American sovereignty, a continued tendency towards unilateralism, expressions of nationalism, and generally a transactional approach to foreign policy that makes fewer and fewer distinctions between traditional allies and adversaries. If Trump is reelected, we should anticipate a continued decoupling of the United States from the international institutions, the norms, and the rules that have shaped international politics and America's role in the world since the end of World War II. Now, Biden calls for America to work more closely with like-minded countries, in which the United States leads by the power of its example. A Biden victory will see the United States undertake policies to extend the liberal international order, or to at least salvage those parts of the order that place America at the center of a community of countries with whom it shares core values, and through multilateral endeavors, seek policy outcomes for America and other countries that advance their common goals. Even if I think this means that America will have to assume a disproportionate costs to provide those goods compared to its partners. If Biden is elected, therefore, we should see an effort to reposition the United States within institutions, norms, and rules. So at a very fundamental level, there is a discontinuity between Trump's vision of America's role in the world and Biden's vision of the world. In short, the candidates have very different visions. And these differences aside, however, the reality is, again, as America's dominant power position in the international political system continues to fall relative to other countries, the ability of the United States to get the outcomes that it wants, regardless of who is president, and regardless of what vision they have for America, will be increasingly constrained. Now, both of these approaches, the Trump approach, the Biden approach, have important implications for how the United States navigates a post-American world order. But again, we should not forget that global forces are moving in a direction that are generally unfavorable to the United States. Global power is more diffuse. New powers, China especially, are rising. Older powers like Russia are returning to the world stage. Non-state actors are increasingly influential. And American power, which tends to be heavily weighted towards military capabilities, is no longer well suited to address the threats that the world faces. For example, COVID and the climate change are perfect examples of how all this great power that America has is not having a great impact on our international relations. Each candidate's vision of America's role in the world will be constrained by global realities, and each candidate's vision of America's role in the world contains both promise and peril. So, what I'd like to do is define some important concepts that are really fundamental to my ability to kind of lay out the argument that I've just presented. First, the question, what is the liberal international order? So before I go any further, I want to take a moment and clear up any confusion or misconception that you might have about the meaning of the liberal international order. Now, this term has been around for quite some time. And if it's unfamiliar to you, which it probably is for most people, there's good reason. Because for the most part, this concept is largely confined to academic circles and among policymakers and policy analysts. Rarely do we ever hear the phrase liberal international order that's used in the media, either on television, cable news, newspapers, etc. The only recent example that I can recall is an interview that happened, I guess about 3 weeks ago on MSNBC with Steve Schmidt. And Steve Schmidt is a Republican Party consultant for the McCain and Romney presidential campaigns. Schmidt said in this interview that the liberal international order is on the ballot in November. And as a mainstream Republican, which of course is a different breed of Republican than a Donald Trump Republican, he says that the liberal international order is worth saving. And this is extraordinary for many people to hear because typically we don't think about Republicans supporting anything that's liberal, right? So let me define what this liberal international order means so that we can kind of clear up any confusion. Here's the Wikipedia definition of the liberal international order, and now I'm quoting from Wikipedia. In international relations, the liberal international order, also referred to as the rules-based US-led liberal international order, describes the notion that contemporary international relations are organized around principles of international cooperation through multilateral institutions, open markets, security cooperation, the promotion of democracy, and leadership by the United States and its allies. So let me give you a short example of what this liberal international order looks like in practice. So on the issue of military security, for instance, the United States has served since 1949 as the anchor of the transatlantic collective security alliance called NATO. In international economic affairs, the United States forged the creation of a post-war international economic order, which is called the Bretton Woods system, which promoted free trade that for a time tied international currencies to the US dollar, and that created a development bank, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund to stabilize national currencies. This American leadership of the liberal economic order also encouraged international macroeconomic policy coordination among countries, such as changes in interest rates and fiscal policy, whether countries should run deficits or surpluses. In the international political and legal affairs, the United States influence proved critical to the founding of the United Nations system and international treaties on a range of issues, from human rights to the protection of the global environment and beyond. So the word liberal in liberal international order tends to throw people off a little bit, because when we use the word liberal in American politics, we essentially mean politics ideologically on the left of the political spectrum, right? Mostly among Democrats. But in international relations and in political theory more generally, the word liberal has a different meaning altogether. So in political theory and in international relations, by liberal is meant the classic Enlightenment idea that people are born free with inherent rights, and that the preservation of their liberty and their rights requires laws and institutions that establish limited government, with the purpose of that government being to ensure liberty while at the same time establishing a law-based order so people can get along by following the rules. So in this context, liberal does not mean the politics of left of center in the United States, but rather it means a liberal view of the world that emphasizes advancing human freedom while at the same time building institutions, norms, and laws to encourage economic interaction, to facilitate the exchange of peoples and ideas, and to build a global community based upon a set of rules and procedures that establishes order and that encourages freedom. So in this sense, when we talk about America having a liberal foreign policy, what we really mean is that presidents that are both Democrat and Republican, from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Harry Truman, Ike Eisenhower, Carter, Reagan, Bush 1, Bush 2, Clinton, Obama, as well as political elites in Congress, can all be considered foreign policy liberals. In this sense, foreign policy liberalism has been the guiding ideology of American foreign policy since the 1940s. It is now essentially reaching its 80th birthday or something thereabouts. Now, as I note a bit further into my talk, Donald Trump is not a foreign policy liberal. He is therefore not a defender of the liberal international order. Biden is a foreign policy liberal and therefore is a defender of the liberal international order. The next point I want to make before I kind of lay out my views of Biden and Trump's foreign policy vision for America is to look at the electoral connection when it comes to foreign policy. That is, how do we think about national elections, presidential elections, in relation to foreign policy issues? So I'm sure you've heard this saying, which says something to the effect that politics stops at the water's edge. This idea is meant to convey the notion that political squabbles in the United States are cast aside once America engages on the world stage, and especially in situations where there's going to be the use of force or likely use of force, and American troops are at stake. Now, we know this is true, but everything that is a truism has elements of not being true, right? So the reality, of course, is a little more complicated than that. Let me quote from an article that I have my students in my foreign policy class read. This is an article that's titled External Affairs and the Electoral Connection by a scholar named Miroslav Ninic. Here's what Ninic has to say about elections and foreign policy. He writes, and I'm quoting him, "Except at times of extreme and immediate threats to values that all Americans embrace, foreign policy, like all policy, is rooted in domestic politics. External policy is about the pursuit of the national interest, which in the vast majority of cases is not objective. There's nothing that we can all agree on. Accordingly, foreign policy, like domestic policy, is a big part of our national election campaigns, and it is inescapably impacted by political debate and by political disagreement." Now, it's certainly true that there is some degree of bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. This was certainly the case during the Cold War. And as you know, during the Cold War, the broad bipartisan consensus essentially argued that the two major political parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans, shared a common understanding of the external threat environment and the best way to deal with that threat. So we agreed on a bipartisan basis that the Soviet Union and global communism posed the most immediate threat to America, and that the strategy of containment, that is preventing the further spread of communism, was that centralizing principle that directed our foreign policy. Democrats and Republicans agreed on that. Now, they disagreed, of course, on some of the details, but what was interesting about that consensus is that you had Democrats who you could call foreign policy hawks, who advocated for a robust military You also had Democrats who were doves, who wanted to try to pursue reconciliation and cooperation with the Soviet Union. Similarly, you had Republicans who were hawks, and you had Republicans who were doves. So in effect, while there was disagreement over foreign policy issues during the Cold War, there was no clear bipartisan disagreement on foreign policy. Democrats and Republicans were on either side of the same issue. That's changed in recent time. This change really began during the period of the Vietnam War, when that consensus was shattered, and we began to see the two political parties move in separate directions when it came to foreign policy. Now, this foreign policy consensus did reemerge during the period of 9/11 and the years thereafter. Americans overwhelmingly agreed that the greatest threat to the United States was radical Islamic fundamentalists who were engaging in terror. And the means to achieve that security required some kind of military confrontation. But again, as 9/11 has faded in our history, its central place as a unifying principle no longer is functioning to build consensus among the two parties. So it is fair to say that that consensus has faded over time, and that the recent history of American foreign policy has seen a growing shift along party lines. So each party is kind of moving away from each other more dramatically than ever before, at least in recent decades, on major foreign policy issues. Now, there is, in fact, a very deep and emerging partisan rift among voters' attitudes when it comes to foreign policy issues. And politicians are very mindful of this growing rift in the views of American voters on foreign policy. Voter preferences when it comes to foreign policy vary. And research shows that foreign policy preferences tend to be clustered around two competing world visions. So for instance, in the pre-2016 election, Republican Party voters generally identified with what scholars call self-regarding goals. That is to say, they were most interested in America pursuing foreign policies that made America better off. By comparison, Democrats tended to identify with foreign policy goals that scholars call other regarding goals. That is to say, Democrats were more concerned about how American foreign policy affected how other countries saw the United States. So whereas Republicans emphasized foreign policy goals that would make America better off, Democratic voters tended to emphasize foreign policy goals that resulted in other people abroad seeing America in a better light. And that's an important distinction that helps to explain this emerging gap in foreign policy thinking among Democrats and Republicans. Both sets of goals, of course, are critical to foreign policy success. We want America to be better off, and we want the world to think better of the United States. However, Republicans tend to favor military strength as a chief tool and unilateral means to achieve America's foreign policy goals. Democrats, by comparison, value diplomacy as the chief tool, and they prefer multilateral means, that is, America working with other countries whenever possible to advance these policy goals. The point here is that these contrasting preferences have widened in recent time, and they have had an impact on the way politicians think about their foreign policy positions. Now, a closer look at American public attitudes towards foreign policy is always something we should be paying attention to. And most recently, I think in late September of this year, maybe less than 3 weeks ago, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which has for years conducted highly regarded foreign policy public opinion polling, released its 2020 Foreign Policy Public Opinion Poll results. And the title of their report is called Divided We Stand, which of course sends an ominous message to the reader about how divided Americans are on foreign policy issues. Let me briefly quote from the report's executive summary and then share some of the polling data that the Chicago Council is reporting. So the summary of the report reads as follows, quote, "The worldwide spread of COVID-19 has reminded Americans that the United States is not immune to events that take place in other parts of the world. Far from feeding calls to retreat from international engagement, Americans remain supportive of an active role for the United States in the world, with solid majorities supporting US security alliances and free trade as the best ways to maintain safety and prosperity. Most Americans also continue to believe that globalization is largely beneficial to the United States." But the report goes on, now the ominous part. "But there are profound differences between Democrats and Republicans on which foreign policy issues matter most today. And they are even more sharply divided on how the United States should deal with these issues and engage the rest of the world." So let me just survey some of the public opinion polling on foreign policy that the Chicago Council has recently produced. And I'm going to run down a couple of results, and then I'm going to move on and then lay out the different world visions that Biden and Trump put forward and how they relate to public opinions about foreign policy today. So here are some of the polls results on pressing global issues that are facing the United States. First, by 68% to 30%, the respondents of the Chicago Council poll agreed that for the good of the country, the United States ought to take an active role in world affairs. The news here is interesting, is that this figure is on the high end of the scale since the Council started asking this question in 1974. Second, as for the coronavirus, Democrats are twice as likely as Republicans to agree with the statement that the coronavirus compels America to cooperate with others to solve global problems. 80% of Democrats agreed with that statement. 40% of Republicans did. Moreover, Republicans are 3 times as more likely to agree with the statement that the coronavirus compels the United States to be more self-sufficient and to not rely upon the rest of the world to deal with global problems. 58% of Republicans agreed to that position, only 18% of Democrats. So again, we see this significant partisan divide. Democrats tend to be more embracing of America's global engagement to deal with global problems. Republicans generally are not. Again, another polling result, 75% of Democrats view favorably the growing connections of the United States economy with the rest of the world. By comparison, only 55% of Republicans also agree. Democrats and Republicans also have very different understandings of major threats that America is facing. For Democrats, the top threats that America faces, the top global threats that America faces are the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and foreign interference in American elections. For Republicans, the principal global threats facing America are completely different. The rise of China, terrorism, and Iran's nuclear activities. So Democrats and Republicans have 2 different sets of principal threats to the United States. Also, Democrats and Republicans have starkly different approaches to foreign policy. Democrats favor more US involvement in international organization, more spending on humanitarian and economic assistance abroad, and America signing free trade agreements with other countries. By contrast, the top political preferences among Republicans are the greater use of drone strikes against terrorist targets, the use of economic sanctions and tariffs against our trade adversaries, and the signing of bilateral trade agreements with countries, not multilateral ones. An area where Democrats and Republicans agree has to do on the use of military force. 82% of Democrats and 71% of Republicans say that the United States should use force either less frequently than it does now, or make no change in the level of its use of force. Only 28% of Republicans think there should be more use of force, but among Democrats, it's only 11%. So to reiterate, there's a deep partisan rift among the American electorate when it comes to foreign policy issues. And this rift is perhaps more significant nowadays than at any other point in the last half century. Consequently, the positions of the major political party presidential candidates reflect where these voters are on foreign policy. Having said that, let me now outline the two visions of the major party candidates on how they see America's international relations and their major foreign policy positions. So Biden's strategic vision for the United States' role in the world is really spelled out in an article that was penned in his name, which appeared in the March-April issue of a popular foreign relations magazine called Foreign Affairs. And the article is titled, "Why America Must Lead Again." In sum, Biden argues that the centerpiece of America's security in a world of increasingly complex and diverse threats is what he calls for a rededication by the United States to global leadership. To this end, President Biden says that a return by America to global leadership means, and I'm quoting him now, salvaging America's reputation by mobilizing the country and America's allies to rapidly meet new challenges, unquote. In addition, the guiding principle of renewed American leadership is the dedication of the United States and its allies to democracy and liberal principles. Again, here, by liberal, I mean the classic sense of a commitment to advance human freedom, laws, rules, and institutions globally. Biden does not imagine the restoration of the American-dominated post-World War II liberal order. But he says that America can and must lead and strive to preserve this order to the extent that it is able, both alone and in conjunction with its allies. He is critical of President Trump, which he says Trump has abdicated America's commitment to the liberal order through a lack of leadership and a lack of concern for defending democracy and liberal values more generally. Now, Biden concedes that America's power, which has for so long served as the main force for maintaining the liberal order, can no longer ensure that order. What he has in mind, therefore, is what I would call an American orchestrated multilateral liberal order comprised of an international community of democracies, the United States and other countries working together and utilizing their combined power and their shared principles to advance their common interests. Like Obama, Biden says that American leadership starts at home. That is, the most effective way for the United States to lead is to lead by example. Well, what does this mean exactly? Biden writes, and I'm quoting him again, "The United States' ability to be a force for progress in the world and to mobilize collective action begins at home. American democracy must be repaired and reinvigorated. The education system must ensure that all kids have an equal shot at success. Eliminated from the criminal justice system should be class and race disparities in sentencing. The Voting Rights Act needs to be restored. And he wants all levels of government, starting with the national government, to take measures to improve people's confidence in the government by promoting government transparency and accountability. By doing these and other things," Biden maintains, "the United States' power will be enhanced, which in turn will strengthen and amplify its leadership." He writes, and I'm quoting him again, as a nation, we have to prove to the world that the United States is prepared to lead again, not just with the example of our power, but also with the power of our example. Now, let me just make an aside here. I think there's something valuable in this thinking by Biden. This concern for American democracy is real. Freedom House, which is a United States-based non-governmental organization, has been tracking freedom and democracy around the world since the early 1970s. And in their latest ranking system for 2020, the United States ranks 51st in its level of freedom. It is tied with the Central American country Belize. It's ranked one above Croatia, which is a republic of the former communist Yugoslavia, and 1 point below Mauritius, which is an island nation in the Indian Ocean between East Africa and the Indian subcontinent. All of America's closest allies, Canada, the European Union states, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, all of them rank much higher than the United States. So we can see empirically a slide, a reduction in the robustness of America's democracy over the past 50 years. Now, this notion that America's global leadership starts at home also extends to the revitalization of the American economy. Biden says that we need to do so in ways that focus on the material needs of the American middle class, investments in infrastructure, access to affordable health care, trade rules that encourage trade liberalization and that also protect American jobs from unfair trading practices. On this point, Biden promises an approach to international trade that demands more from China. He also promises new trade agreements that require investments in American people and industry before the United States will allow countries greater access to our markets. So what are the implications of Biden's vision for major foreign policy issues? In addition to this core strategic goal that Biden has, there are a number of foreign policy positions that flow from this idea of American leadership. A successful foreign policy, Biden says, starts with effective diplomacy. Biden concedes that the United States has been much too quick to resort to the use of force. In fact, Biden supported the resolution on the Iraq War in 2003. And that force is and should be the last resort and should only be employed when our vital interests are at stake. The use of force does not mean major military deployments. Biden wants to shift from major deployments and use special operations forces, thus greatly lightening the US military footprint abroad. Biden also emphasizes America working in concert with other countries that share our values. To promote this, he calls for a summit of the world's democracies in which these countries would chart a common set of global initiatives and work together to achieve them. Among the chief foreign policy challenges or threats facing the United States, Biden argues there is no greater one than climate change, which is consistent with public opinion polling among Democrats. Biden pledges America's immediate return to the Paris Climate Treaty. Another top priority is the coronavirus. In addition to a national plan to address the pandemic and leading a coordinated international response, Biden would have the US rejoin the World Health Organization and thereby commit the United States to financially underwriting the WTO's activities. He also promises to make human rights a key issue in US bilateral relations with both China and Russia. So now let's compare Biden's thinking with President Trump's thinking. And I'll do this in two parts. First, I'll kind of lay out his vision, and then I'll look at some of the policies, and then I'll offer some concluding remarks and finish the presentation. So Trump's foreign policy is framed around the slogan, America First, which is a critical pillar of the president's Make America Great Again mantra. America First underscores the notion that international relations is, at its very core, a competitive realm among sovereign states, with each state pursuing its own set of interests. And that President Trump is dedicated to placing the interests of the United States above the interests of other countries, just as he believes other countries place their interests ahead of the United States' interests. Among scholars, this sort of thinking combines elements of realism and nationalism. So Trump's worldview is realist and nationalist. It's not liberal. As a rhetorical device, America First also says that past presidential administrations, both Democrats and Republicans, have not prioritized America's interests. Rather, he argues, American leaders have acted abroad in the service of the interests of others, and in doing so has been taken advantage of repeatedly. Hence, because the American created and the American liberal order has for decades served as a mechanism by which the United States has served the interest of others at its own expense, America First essentially means that America must back away from that international liberal order. Indeed, the president imagines international relations playing out among a collection of sovereign states, each looking out for its own interests, making deals with one another to advance their particular interests. What makes America different, however, according to President Trump, is that America has the power and the willingness to use that power, to push its weight around, to get the deals and outcomes that it prefers. Trump's thinking about America and the world has been consistent since he declared his intentions to run for president. And the full articulation of his thinking is spelled out in his administration's 2017 National Security Strategy. At the center of this strategy is American leadership on the world stage, but it is a form of American leadership that is distinct from what previous administrations have pursued and what Biden himself envisions. For Trump, American leadership begins with American power that yields a global balance of power that favors the United States. It is an understanding of leadership that says America's greatest power will serve as a magnet that will draw other countries into its orbit. The opening line of this document says as much, and I'm quoting it. An America that is safe, prosperous, and free at home is an America with the strength, the confidence, and the will to lead abroad. Putting America first is the duty of our government and the foundations of American leadership of the world. This strategy has four main pillars. The first pillar says that the administration's top priority is to protect the American people, the American homeland, and the American way of life. This means dealing with nuclear proliferation, getting tough on immigration, and promising to pursue terrorist threats to their source, wherever that may be. The second pillar argues that the security of the United States requires prosperity at home. Therefore, the president promises to rejuvenate the domestic economy, promote free and fair trade and reciprocal economic relationships to ensure that America is the world leader in research, technology, invention, and innovation, and that embraces what he calls America's quote-unquote energy dominance. Now, the president recognizes the contributions of the liberal international order in helping to rebuild the world economy after World War II. But he argues that that vision is no longer relevant because the countries that we helped to revive after World War II are now our principal economic adversaries, and that therefore we had to get tough with them and to compete with them and to end the unfairness of the system, which has allowed them to benefit at our expense. The third pillar of the Trump strategy calls for peace through strength. It envisions an America that remains the dominant global military power with a considerable distance between itself and other world powers. China and Russia are listed as the chief threats to the United States, as well as so-called regimes or so-called rogue regimes, namely Iran and North Korea, as well as ISIS or radical Islamic organizations. The best way to manage these threats, again, is with lots of military capability. Finally, the fourth pillar of Trump's national security strategy calls for the United States to advance America's influence abroad. It pledges not to impose America's will on others, but to win them over through America's success and America's efforts to build a strong and prosperous country. On foreign policy issues other than trade, Trump has stepped outside of the confines of the liberal international order. Consider NATO. Trump maintains that the US's European allies do not pay their fair share of the costs of maintaining the military alliance, and that they literally owe the United States tens of billions of dollars. The same goes for Japan and South Korea. This problem was addressed in previous administrations when all NATO states pledged to increase their military spending. But some have met their targets while others have not, in particular Germany. In retaliation, President Trump decided to remove thousands of US forces from Germany, without consulting the allies and without allowing NATO to make a collective determination as to whether or not this change would be in NATO's collective defense interests. Moreover, the president has questioned the need for NATO and at times has suggested that the United States might leave the alliance altogether. The administration has also taken a tough line against international institutions that the president says are cheating the United States and therefore do not adequately serve American interests. So for instance, he opposes the Climate Paris Agreement because he says it places too heavy a burden on the United States to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. The United States also walked away from the Iran nuclear deal, its membership in the World Health Organization, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been a multilateral free trade agreement that would have joined 18 countries in a free trade bloc to counter the rising economic power of China. In addition, Trump has been highly critical of leaders of other liberal democracies, including Germany's Angela Merkel, Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, the President Macron of France, and even former British Prime Minister Theresa May and Boris Johnson. Adding insult to injury, for some at least, Trump has had glowing words for leaders of authoritarian countries, in particular Putin and President Xi of China. And he's cultivated strong relationships with prime ministers and presidents in Poland, Hungary, Turkey, and Brazil, whose commitment to democracy seems to be waning. The scholarly consensus says that President Trump is not dedicated to the liberal international order. Rather, at best, he sees it as an instrument, that is a means to achieve America's foreign policy goals and not an end in and of itself. If the order somehow complements the president's goals, then America will support that order. If it does not complement America's goals, then America won't support that order. The problem with the thinking, according to critics, is that in the absence of America's commitment to maintaining the liberal order, that order is likely to weaken, which then renders it less and less useful as a mechanism for the United States to advance its interests. So let me offer some concluding comments, and then we'll entertain the questions that you might have. So in conclusion, let me reiterate my main point. The liberal international order, as we have known it over the past 70+ years, is a thing of the past. America is no longer in a position to underwrite the provision of public goods, that is, to guarantee security, to ensure an open world economy, to promote multilateralism, all of these things that have characterized the liberal order since 1945. Moreover, for many years now, there's been a growing reluctance on the part of the American people for the United States to assume the disproportionate costs of maintaining the order and American global leadership. Recent events have worked against this order. The rise of China, the ill-fated Iraq invasion and occupation, the 2006 financial crisis, and now even COVID-19 and its impact on the US and the world economy. Neither Biden nor Trump will bring America home and create a fortress America. Neither Biden nor Trump will try to move America away from the world, that is, make America an inward-looking country. That's not going to happen. Biden promises a reconfigured liberal order, one in which America works in concert with others to achieve common interests. Trump sees a post-liberal international order in which America's assertiveness, and if necessary, its willingness to defy liberal norms and rules and laws will become regularized. It is highly unlikely, in conclusion, that the American people will be casting their ballots on the basis of their views on each candidate's position on foreign policy relations. And yet, the outcome of the election will certainly impact our country's foreign policies in ways great and small in the years to come, and will have an impact on how America, and even if America, can or wants to sustain the liberal order in one way or another in the years ahead. Well, that's the extent of my presentation, and I thank you for your patience and for tuning in. I now want to hand it back to Beth, who is going to be feeding me questions that I can then respond to.
Jim, thank you so much for your lecture. Whenever we host you at the library or virtually, it's always so very informative. So
thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us, with our patrons, with attendees. We've enabled the chat box, So if anyone has a question, you can type it in the chat box. You can access the chat box if you click on the icon at the bottom of your screen. It says chat, and you can type in any questions there. At the moment, we don't have any questions, but I'll just take this time to thank the Friends of the Library that sponsored your lecture today, and we appreciate their generosity. I'd also like to remind everyone to visit hplibrary.org, the library's website, for news on upcoming programs as part of our Library in Your Living Room series of virtual programs. On Sunday, we have a lecture from the artistic director of the Shakespeare Project of Chicago on the first folio, and that's at 1 o'clock, and you can register by visiting our website. So again, visit hplibrary.org for news about the library and upcoming programs. And I don't see any questions here at the moment. Oh, here we go. Judith is asking, any chance Trump will attempt to stay in office even if he loses? Do you want to tackle that one?
Well, you know, it's not a foreign policy issue, but let's try to engage that one. I have no idea. How's that? My sense is that the real issue is trying to affect how the votes are counted, so that the president is able to direct the outcome of the election in a way that favors him. I think that's the big issue. Not so much that he'll refuse to leave, but that he'll try to affect how the votes are being counted, right? And we've already seen efforts, for example, in Pennsylvania, there is legislation to subpoena mail-in ballots, therefore possibly they won't be counted. There are efforts in other countries, other states, for example, Texas, now limits drop-off ballots to one location per county. So there are all these little mechanisms that are being put in to kind of direct the outcome to affect the count. I think that's the real issue. Once we have the count, I think whether he leaves will basically have been decided by the outcome of the count. But who knows? Who knows?
Thanks, Jim. We have another question. Margie is asking, do you think America can regain our standing in the world after the past 4 years?
Good question. If Joe Biden wins the presidency, I think it's highly likely that America's standing in the world will improve. However, having said that, and emphasizing a point that I made in my presentation, it's just quite clear to me that despite our best intentions, that America's ability to kind of reshape the world in its image is increasingly limited. So there's only so much that America can do. And we are bound to run into some difficulty with our allies and certainly with our adversaries. It's not going to be a perfect reunion, but it is likely to produce greater level of standing and support for the United States under a Biden presidency than what we've seen under the Trump presidency, for sure.
Thank you. Unless anyone else has another question, I think that that wraps it up today. We're almost at 2 o'clock. And again, Jim, I thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Sure, thank you, Beth.
And it's always a great pleasure to host you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. And again, thanks to Jim. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.